actually finish a sermon series entitled Asking for a Friend. We've been moving through this simple idea that if you spend much time on social media, that people will pose a question, and because it's a little embarrassing or they have some issue with putting it out there, that they try to refer that it's actually being a friend who's asking it. And there are all kinds of these all over the internet, and so many of them kind of result in being funny. I've tried to share with you maybe some of the funnier ones. Some of them are more truthful. There was this three I'll share with you just real quick, is does it really work as seen on TV? All right, asking for a friend. Do monkeys make really good pets? Asking for a friend. The one I ran across the most, and still my favorite, and you won't be able to see this image, all right, is this. When giraffes go to work, do you think they put their necktie at the top or the bottom of their necks? Asking for a friend. There's lots of questions out there that we have, and we pose them on somebody else so that we don't have to deal with them. And as Christians, we have some questions about faith, about the things in the church, and so often we like to do is push those off as if it were someone else asking, because we feels like, well, I'm lacking faith, or something's wrong for me to ask this question. So we've been working through some of those big questions about why is the world such a mess? Why do Christians seem so intolerant? And today, why are so many Christians hypocrites? Why are so many Christians hypocrites? And I want to work through this process with you. And I recognize that this is one of those things that most people just don't really ask as a question. They sort of accept it as a fact. That people in the church, well, I don't go to that church because they're full of hypocrites. And if you heard that at work this week, you wouldn't think anything of it. I'm not a believer because believers are hypocrites. I don't follow Jesus because Jesus followers are hypocrites. And you just kind of accept that. But is it the truth? I mentioned a church last week out in Arizona that did a phone survey of over 4,000 people. And they asked this question about hypocrisy in the church. And there was almost half of them said, yes, the church is full of hypocrites. Then the follow-up question was, can you name one? So they asked everyone for a name of someone that they believed was a hypocrite. And they got a list, ready? 17 names. 4,000 people, they got a list of 17 names. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Ted Haggard. What they found of those 17 names, real names, that 3 of them were dead, and one of them said they weren't not a believer anymore. It was a pretty small pool. Here's what the number one response was that they got when they asked for a name of someone you know is a hypocrite. Was a character in a movie or a TV show. See, it's perceived that everybody out there is a hypocrite, and yet most of us have very little first-hand information. And so my question changed a little bit as I worked on this sermon. What do we do as a believer when you recognize that most people see you as a hypocrite? What do you do when you recognize that most people see Christians as hypocrites? Why are there so many hypocrites? Well, to answer that question, like any question, I want to go to the Bible. And I want to dig into what it has to say. And we're going to today reach at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12. And Jesus is teaching, and he's been working through some different material. And in chapter 12, when you get into the Bible, the translators like to do is add in these little divisions over chapters and headings, so it makes it easier for you to find things and recognize breaks. Well, when you get to chapter 12, it says warnings and encouragements, which basically meant we don't know what to label this. We're not even sure they're connected together. We're just going to throw a label out there. But I believe they're all connected. And what I'm going to do today is walk through really quickly, all right, 5 short thoughts about hypocrisy. 5 short thoughts about hypocrisy, all from Luke chapter 12, just walking through this verse by verse, the first 9 verses. We're going to start with verse 1, okay? Meanwhile, a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling one another. Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." Be on your guard against hypocrisy. Jesus is really reaching the height of his fame at this point in time on earth. It says that the thousands, that's what it says there. The Greek word is myriad. When it's used in the book of Acts, it's a reference to 10,000 people. Many as 10,000 people have gathered to hear Jesus. Luke has this comment, they're so close together, they're trampling on one another. A mass crowd has gathered, and Jesus is going to take this opportunity to teach on something that is foundational and important. Something that he's sure everyone needs to hear. And here's his instruction: beware of hypocrisy. Beware of hypocrisy. Now, I have to make some different notes as I go through this. It says he said to his disciples. Now, that's an important thing to recognize. A disciple is someone who is learning and growing and following Jesus. Okay? They're learning and growing. Part of our problem, we saw right up front, with hypocrisy is that there's a lot of people who want to come to church once in a while, and that's it. And their life is not about, I'm growing and walking with the Lord. And it's easy sometimes to label them in with committed disciples and say, look at all the hypocrisy in their life. It's also sometimes gets labeled people who are not even followers of Jesus. They might claim that I believe there's a God, but that's about it. Jesus says that to the people who are following me, I want you to be on your guard. Beware is the word. Beware. When I was in England just for a summer, my job was to walk from house to house. Every house has a mail slot in it, and I was to put these flyers for the church in all of the mail slots. And sometimes I would come up to a house, and they'd have a big fence, and there would always be this big sign, beware of dog. Now, if you know me, I'm not a dog fan anyway. So what I learned was just pass by that house. All right? Jesus can deal with them some other way. I'm not going in there because I know what beware means. And that's his word here. Put up a fence. Put up a sign. Don't go into this area. Beware of the yeast. He changes the image a little bit. They would have been very familiar with this, that in their culture they made their own bread, and it just takes a little bit of yeast to work out leaven to then work into the loaf. And it takes just a little pinch to influence a whole loaf. And he says, you got to beware of this little bit, this tiny bit could get into your heart of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. What does the word mean? We use it a lot. Someone's a hypocrite, or that's hypocrisy. What does it mean? Well, the term actually is a reference to the theater. In their culture, nearby they had a theater, and people would dress up and play characters. And they would dress up and they would make masks out of mud or out of plaster, and they'd put these large masks on a stick, and they would put that up over their face, and they would pretend to be something that they're not. And that's what the word means. A hypocrite is an actor. It's someone who's trying to hide their identity, someone trying to be something that they are not. Now, this is not the only time Jesus has used a word. And in fact, in this context, he's been using it quite a bit. If you go back into chapter 11, in verse 37, he starts to confront the Pharisees. Okay? And the Pharisees are the religious leaders of the day. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And he's told them things like this. You guys will give 1/10. Okay, you'll go up to the temple, 1/10 of your spices. You will measure it out on a fine scale. And yet there doesn't seem to be any love in you. He says, you like recognition. You like the chief seats. You like to be recognized as someone who's special. And then he says, you killed the prophets, by the way. Verse 45 of chapter 11. Jesus, you insult us when you say these things. It was not a compliment. But you have to recognize what Jesus is saying. Hypocrite is not just a reference to a sinner. In fact, Jesus very rarely uses it in reference to the crowd. Hypocrites were usually in reference to the Pharisees, Sadducees, and teachers of the law. And here's why: because they were people who were using religion for gain. They loved the recognition it brought. You know, if I tell people I'm a Christian, it'll help me get further in my career a little bit. There'll be people who will say, well, he's a good guy. They love to be recognized. They love to stand in the front, have special seats. They love to use religion to further their own benefit. That's what it meant to be a hypocrite. They didn't care about God. They just cared about how they appeared to others. And Jesus warns against even just a little bit of that getting into your soul, because it can begin to grow. I was a first-year Bible college student when there was an expose done on Robert Tilton. Some of you will know that name. He was a televangelist. They went behind his ministry building and they found a dumpster, and in the dumpster they started opening envelopes, and there were boxes of envelopes. What you would do is you'd mail in your donation and then your prayer request, and they'd clearly been opened up, the donation taken out, sealed back up, and thrown into a dumpster. He had a $24 million a year income in 1991, did Robert Tilton. And there's a simple name for that. It's hypocrite. It's someone who's after their own personal gain and really don't care about furthering the kingdom of God. And so he warns against hypocrisy. And then he moves on and he says, but understand this little seed that can get inside of you. Understand that God knows everything. That God knows everything. Picking up verse 2. There's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What is said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what is whispered in the ear of the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the rooftops. So the reason that we push back against hypocrisy is you may be fooling some of the people around you, but you're not fooling God. God knows and sees everything. It says He sees everything you do. There's nothing that you do that's hidden. It could be small. It could be big. I had a lady one time, she confessed to me, she had to be in her late 30s, and she said, when I was 8 years old, my mother sent me to the store with a $10 bill and bought these groceries. I bought myself a piece of candy. And on the way home, I ate the candy. I said, here's your change. She said, is that all the change? And I said, yes. For 30 years, she'd been carrying around this guilt of something so small. I think there's so many things that we all do, that some of that we've just forgotten about. He says, you're going to be called into account for everything you did, and you're going to be called into account for everything you said, no matter how you said it. Everything that you wouldn't tell your preacher, all those stories, all the words you wouldn't use around your preacher. You're going to be called into account for all of those things. He says, your heavenly Father knows. Nothing's getting by him. As I did research and was hypocrisy, I ran across this illustration on one lady was telling about her sister. She said, my sister, if you were to look at her social media, just looks like such a good Christian. She's always posting religious things. She said, the difficulty is she'll go for 2 weeks to a mission trip and she'll put the pictures out there. And yet, she goes, I know that they're addicted to painkillers. I know that on weekends they often will use recreational drugs. She said that there's nothing in their life that resembles that. And the honest truth is, I know she shares that story with pain and hurt, is that God sees the double life. He knows what's going on. God sees. Third thing here, God will judge. God will judge. Verse 4. I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of the one who can kill the body and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. It's easy for us to understand fearing for our own lives. We put locks on our doors. We have security systems to try to protect ourselves. I have a pastor I know. Every time, it seems to come up he brings it up in every conversation. I have a pastor I know, he always ends up showing me that he's a concealed carry, and he'll do anything to protect himself and his congregation. Okay, whatever you feel like makes you safe, I guess. My wife, when she walks in the country anymore, has a stun gun thing that she carries with her because she's had a couple run-ins. We understand what it's like to fear for our lives. Now let's put this in its context real quick before I move on. See, the people there had just met. If you go back in the previous verses, they had just talked to Pharisees about killing Jesus. That was the words they were saying that God knew. But the reason that they were saying those words is that they would spread out. And they thought, if Jesus knows we're going to take his life, then he'll stop talking against us. If he realizes that we're going to kill him, we will be our fear for his life will motivate him to change his behavior. And Jesus says, I'm not scared of you. All you can do is kill my body. I'm scared of the one in whom I will have to stand before in a judgment. And then he uses this word, NIV says hell. I'll say I preached on this topic last Halloween, October 31st. If you go back online, you can listen to that sermon. I'm not going to redo my sermon on hell, but I'm going to tell you here, he uses a word named Gehenna. It's for the valley of Hinnom that's outside of Jerusalem. At one time, it was cursed under Jeremiah. Now it's become a place they believe where they were throwing trash, and it was known as a worthless place where often the worm didn't die and the fire didn't go out. He says, you're going to be thrown there. God can throw you and judge you either way. Now, I want you to know, I think that Jesus is saying this about God because he's a good parent. Okay? Anyone in here who's a parent or grandparent, grandparents maybe not so much, parents, you know there's two kinds of motivation. Two kinds of motivation with your kids. One is reward, right? If you do this, you will get this blessing. If you don't do this, you'll get this blessing. And there's punishment. If you do this, in our house, and I said this in first service, I got like one chuckle and a lot of weird looks, but I'll just tell you, take this how you want to. In our house, you know, we had reward or we had the wooden spoon. All right? That's how it functions in our house. And you understand that you do the right things, there's reward, but if you do the wrong things, there will be punishment. And that's not because I'm mean, it's because I'm a loving father. And he says that's what waits here. God will judge, but recognize that God cares. His judgment comes from care. Verse 6, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? You're not one of them, is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. He draws this connection to sparrows, this tiny bird that were sold in the market. They were sold for 2 reasons. Okay, one was they could be offered as a sacrifice. They were a living animal. Their blood could be used as a sacrifice. And 2, they could also be provided as food. But they were the cheapest thing to sell. 2 of them could be bought for 1 small coin. And he says, even though they're tiny, God knows them. Then he mentions this, the hairs on your head are numbered. I don't remember a lot of people's prayers. I mean, I've heard thousands of them through the years. But one prayer I remember very specifically. I was only in junior high or so. And our church had, like a lot of churches had back then, this won't mean anything to some of you will understand this completely. We had the communion table at the front, and they would come down, and the 2 elders would guard it, you know, they'd stand on either side, and the deacons would go pass out the trays. And usually one elder would pray for the offering, and one would pray for the communion. And I don't even remember which one he was praying for, but I can remember very specifically. Chuck Akers was his name. He prayed this prayer. He said, God, you know the number of the hairs on our head, not because you are neurotic, but because you are infinitely wise. It just always stuck with me. That God has the wisdom to know the hairs on our head. And he says, you're more valuable than these. We had a song in 1905 that came out. I know I am happy. I know why I am free, because his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. That's the meaning of this verse. And so you have to lay this in its context. Jesus is saying, the reason that God sees everything you do is not because he's wanting to catch you doing bad. It's because God cares about you. He's watching everything that you do, and occasionally you just happen to do something bad. See, we come to picture God sometimes. One preacher, Jeff Walling, describes it this way. We sometimes picture God as like this state trooper in Alabama that just pulled you over. Well, what do we got here? He enjoys catching us doing evil. That's not the point. The point is that God is trying to care for you, and he watches over everything that you do with a careful, loving eye. And sometimes you do evil. And like a parent, there's disappointment. You knew better. You should have done better. So what do? Well, that leads us to the last thing. You cling to Jesus. Verse 8, I tell you, whoever publicly acknowledges me before others, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But whoever disowns me before others will be disowned before the angels of God. Jesus refers to himself. He calls himself the Son of Man. It's his favorite title for himself, actually. It's this idea that he's the all Godhead, but he's been born as a human. He says, if you acknowledge me, that word acknowledge is kind of a twofold reference. One is that you are going to speak about me. If you're willing to tell others that you believe in me. Before we have a baptism here, we do that very thing. Every time we repeat the good confession of faith. I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If you proclaim that publicly in front of a church and people who care about you, if you're willing to proclaim that privately to people that you know, whoever acknowledges me. But it's not just about the words you say, it's about the actions. That's the context. He's been talking about this difference between actions and motives. He says, you need to, with your words and your actions, be proclaiming me as Lord. Now, this is where the split begins to happen, and I hope you follow me. All of us sin. All of us sin. But that does not inherently make all of us a hypocrite. Okay? A hypocrite is someone who sins and ceases to acknowledge Jesus. Does that make sense? There's someone who says, you know what? I sinned. It's just who I am. Oh, well. As long as people think I'm a Christian, what difference does it make? As long as my persona is out there, what difference does it make? And in fact, sometimes if someone knew this story and it was going to hurt my public persona, we'll just keep it hidden. We'll wear a mask. You're a hypocrite when you're a sinner and you hide it all and you don't bring it before God and you stop clinging to the grace offered in Jesus. See, but all of us are sinners and all of us need Jesus. The difference is people who walk with Jesus are people who are clinging to the grace that only God can provide. See, the great thing about the Bible is that as you walk through the Bible, all of the Bible characters are flawed. All of them. I mean, go back to the beginning. Noah gets off the ark and he gets drunk. Abraham lies about his wife. Moses gets angry and disobeys God. David is an adulterer. But they're not hypocrites. They are sinners who continue to go back to the grace of God. So you become a hypocrite the moment that you're worried more about how it appears to other people than about how it is to God. The moment you become a hypocrite is when you start trying to hide all these things and push away from the grace found in Jesus. Hypocrites are people who are no longer living for Jesus, but about public opinion. All of us are sinners. And the hope is that you will come before God and you will open up your heart and you will reveal the pain and you say, God, transform me through Jesus, and you come back to that again and again and again. See, it's only a few chapters over. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus is going to tell a parable about a Pharisee, another Pharisee, and a tax collector. And they're going to go up to the temple, and the Pharisee is going to stand up and say, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not a murderer. I'm not even like this tax collector. And then the tax collector stands up and says, Lord, have mercy on me. Beats his chest. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. So here's the truth. They're both sinners, but only one was a hypocrite. And here's what I want you to hear. I hope that you don't care how anybody else out there perceives you. I hope if people look at your life and they don't know you very well and they look at you and they go, oh, that guy's a hypocrite. Who cares? I'm not living for public approval. What you have to do is whenever you make a mistake is you come before Jesus, and as long as you are in right relationship with Him, that's all that matters. I hope that your life is grounded on the grace of Jesus. And that is all that is important to you. Let's pray. Father God,